A false heir is a person who appears at the right moment, wearing the right face, carrying the right story. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. My name is William, and over the years I've committed crimes ranging from petty fraud to things that still wake me up at 3 in the morning. Some people steal wallets. Some rob banks. I stole something far stranger, a family's future. This happened about 12 years ago. Back then, I was broke, angry at the world, and convinced that everyone else was playing a game with loaded dice. I had debts I couldn't pay, creditors calling daily, and just enough charm to talk my way into trouble. I wasn't looking for an opportunity when I first heard about the Heir family inheritance. The opportunity found me. A man named Edward Heir had died at 86 without any children that anyone knew about. He'd owned farmland, properties, investments, more money than I had ever seen in my life. The family had spent months searching for distant relatives who might have a legal claim to the estate. Then a rumor surfaced. Years earlier, Edward's younger brother had supposedly fathered a child while traveling abroad. Nobody knew the child's name. Nobody knew where he ended up. Most people assumed the story was nonsense. Most people. When I heard it, something clicked in my head. A missing heir. An incomplete family tree. A fortune waiting for someone convincing enough to claim it. I should have walked away right then. Any reasonable person would have. Instead, I spent the entire night thinking about how easy it might be to become someone else. That was the moment the crime truly began, not when I forged documents, not when I lied in court, not when I collected money that wasn't mine. It began when I decided that if the family wanted an heir badly enough, I could give them one. Me. Once the idea settled into my head, it refused to leave. For weeks, I treated the inheritance story like a puzzle. I wasn't thinking like a thief anymore. I was thinking like an actor preparing for the role of a lifetime. Every article, obituary, and public record related to the Heir family became part of my research. I spent evenings in libraries and nights digging through online archives. The biggest problem was obvious. I wasn't related to them. But the rumor itself worked in my favor. Nobody knew exactly who the missing descendant was supposed to be. The story had gaps, and gaps are dangerous things. People naturally want to fill them. I began collecting details about Edward's brother, where he traveled, who knew him, and which years of his life were poorly documented. The more I learned, the more I realized that uncertainty was my greatest ally. I wasn't creating evidence yet. I was creating a believable version of William. A version that had never existed before. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell myself I was only exploring an idea. At first, I justified everything as harmless curiosity. I wasn't hurting anyone by reading records or taking notes. But eventually the research turned into planning, and planning turned into commitment. I created folders filled with timelines, names, and family connections. I mapped out exactly where my invented history would overlap with the real Heir family story. Every lie needed support from another lie. Every answer had to sound natural enough that nobody would question it. What surprised me most was how much effort went into preparing for conversations that might never happen. I rehearsed explanations while driving. I practiced answering imaginary questions in front of a mirror. I even changed small habits and expressions to fit the character I was building. The goal wasn't simply to convince people. The goal was to convince them so completely that they would never think to doubt me. Looking back, that's the moment my confidence became dangerous. The fantasy was starting to feel real, and I was beginning to believe my own story. After nearly 3 months of preparation, I reached the point where planning wasn't enough anymore. If I wanted this scheme to work, I had to step into the story I'd created. I started carefully. No dramatic claims. No demands for money. I contacted a genealogical researcher who had previously worked with the Heir family, and presented myself as someone searching for information about my late father. I acted uncertain, almost reluctant. People trust hesitation more than confidence. The researcher asked questions I had anticipated dozens of times. Names, dates, places, family history. My heart pounded through every conversation, but I stuck to the script. Whenever I encountered something I didn't know, I admitted uncertainty instead of forcing an answer. That decision helped more than any forged detail ever could. Soon, curiosity started spreading among people connected to the estate. Instead of me chasing the inheritance, it felt like the inheritance was slowly chasing me. For the first time, strangers discussed the possibility that I might belong to the family. And hearing them say it aloud gave me a thrill I still remember. Once people started considering the possibility that I was connected to the Heir family, everything became more complicated. Before that, I had only been managing information. Now I had to manage impressions. I was invited to informal meetings with relatives, lawyers, and people who had known Edward years earlier. Every interaction felt like walking across a frozen lake, never knowing whether the next step would crack the ice beneath me. The relatives were not what I expected. I had imagined cold, suspicious people protecting their inheritance. Some were skeptical, certainly, but others seemed genuinely hopeful. They wanted answers. They wanted the missing piece of a family story that had remained unfinished for decades. That made the deception harder. One elderly cousin looked at me during a gathering and said I had the same eyes as Edward's brother. The comment wasn't scientific or meaningful, but everyone smiled when she said it. Including me. That smile haunted me later. Because for a brief moment, I stopped feeling like an imposter pretending to belong. I felt like I actually belonged there. And that was a dangerous feeling. Up to that point, luck had been carrying me forward. People were asking questions, but they were the questions I had prepared for. Then the first real obstacle appeared. One of the attorneys handling the estate suggested a deeper investigation into my background. The moment I heard those words, a cold weight settled in my stomach. Until then, my story had survived because it lived in uncertainty. The less people knew, the easier it was to guide their assumptions. A thorough investigation threatened to replace assumptions with facts. For several sleepless nights, I imagined everything collapsing. I pictured police officers at my door, angry relatives demanding answers, newspapers publishing my name. Every possible disaster played through my head. I considered walking away. Seriously. But greed has a way of making retreat feel impossible. I had invested months into the deception. I had sacrificed relationships, money, and countless hours building this identity. Instead of quitting, I doubled down. I gathered more records, refined my timeline, and prepared explanations for every inconsistency I could find. The deeper I went, the harder escape became. The background investigation didn't destroy me immediately, but it created problems I hadn't expected. The investigators found small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. No single detail capable of exposing me. But lies rarely fail all at once. They fail one crack at a time. An old date didn't match perfectly with a travel record. A document contained information that couldn't be independently verified. A witness remembered an event differently than I described it. Individually, these issues seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. I noticed the change during meetings. Questions became more specific. Conversations lasted longer. People stopped accepting simple answers. Every discussion felt less like a family reunion and more like an interview. One evening, a relative named Margaret pulled me aside after a gathering. She wasn't hostile. In fact, her kindness made the conversation worse. She looked at me and quietly said, "I hope you're telling the truth, William. A lot of people have put their faith in you." I nodded and assured her I was. Then I went home and stared at my reflection for nearly an hour. Because I knew she was trusting a stranger. A few weeks later, something happened that changed the entire situation. The estate lawyers informed me that my claim was being taken seriously enough to move forward through formal legal channels. It wasn't a victory, but it was far more than I had expected when this began. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt trapped. Until then, the scheme had existed in a strange gray area. There was always an opportunity to disappear, change cities, and pretend none of it had happened. Now documents were being filed. Meetings were scheduled. My name was appearing in official records connected to a multimillion-dollar inheritance dispute. The lie was no longer a private invention. It had entered the real world. Friends noticed changes in me. I became distracted and irritable. I avoided questions about work and spent most evenings reviewing notes or rehearsing explanations. Every ringing phone sounded like bad news. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the thrill. The impossible was actually happening. The role I had created for myself was being accepted by people with the power to change my life forever. And that realization was intoxicating. Just when I thought I understood every thread around me, a new one appeared. His name was Daniel Heir, a distant relative who had spent years researching the family's history as a personal hobby. Unlike the lawyers, Daniel wasn't interested in legal procedures. Unlike the investigators, he wasn't following a checklist. He was genuinely obsessed with the truth. The first time we met, he was polite enough. He asked questions about places, family stories, and people I supposedly knew. Nothing aggressive. Nothing unusual. But there was something unsettling about him. He listened too carefully. Most people hear what they expect to hear. Daniel paid attention to details. He remembered previous conversations and noticed contradictions that others missed. Within days, I learned he had started conducting his own research. That terrified me more than the official investigation ever had. A professional investigator has limits and deadlines. An obsessed amateur has neither. I began monitoring every message, every phone call, every rumor that reached me. My confidence started fading, replaced by constant anxiety. For the first time since the scheme began, I wasn't thinking about success. I was thinking about survival. Every long con eventually depends on one dangerous assumption, that you'll stay disciplined forever. I didn't. After months of pressure, stress, and constant scrutiny, I became careless. Not dramatically careless. The kind of careless that feels insignificant at the time. Daniel contacted me one afternoon and asked about a town where I claimed to have spent part of my childhood. I had rehearsed that section of my story dozens of times. Normally, I would have answered carefully. Instead, I answered too quickly. I mentioned a local landmark that hadn't existed during the years I supposedly lived there. The mistake was tiny. The look on Daniel's face wasn't. He didn't challenge me. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and changed the subject. That reaction frightened me more than an accusation would have. The entire drive home, I replayed the conversation in my head. By evening, I knew exactly what had happened. Daniel had noticed. For the next several days, panic followed me everywhere. I barely slept. Every email notification made my pulse jump. I had spent nearly a year constructing a perfect illusion. And now I feared one careless sentence might bring the whole thing down. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Daniel called and asked if we could meet privately. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but I already knew what the conversation would be about. During the entire drive to the cafe, I considered turning around and disappearing. Instead, I went. Daniel arrived carrying a folder thick with notes and documents. He didn't waste time with small talk. One by one, he laid out the inconsistencies he had uncovered. The incorrect dates. The conflicting records. The childhood story that didn't match the historical timeline of the town. Each piece by itself looked minor. Together, they were devastating. What shocked me most was that Daniel wasn't angry. He seemed disappointed. He asked me a simple question. "Who are you really?" For a few seconds, I almost told him everything. The pressure of maintaining the lie had become unbearable. But fear won. I denied everything. I challenged his conclusions, offered explanations, and insisted the discrepancies were misunderstandings. He listened quietly before gathering his papers. Then he said something that stayed with me for years. "The truth always catches up eventually, William." After my meeting with Daniel, I knew the situation had changed permanently. Before, I had been fighting suspicion. Now I was fighting evidence. Within weeks, more questions started appearing from lawyers and family members. Requests for clarification became requests for documentation. Friendly conversations became formal interviews. People who had once welcomed me warmly now watched me with cautious expressions. The shift was impossible to ignore. I responded the only way I knew how, by trying to control the damage. I produced additional explanations, pointed to gaps in historical records, and argued that old family histories were rarely perfect. Some of my arguments were convincing. Most weren't. What made everything worse was the uncertainty. Nobody had publicly accused me of fraud yet. No dramatic revelation had occurred. Instead, trust was slowly evaporating. That process was far more painful than I expected. I found myself isolated. Friends grew tired of my secrecy. Family members avoided difficult conversations. Even simple daily activities felt exhausting because part of my mind was constantly calculating risks. The lie hadn't collapsed. But I could hear the structure creaking beneath its own weight. The end arrived without the dramatic scene I had always imagined. There was no courtroom confession. No police officers bursting through a door. No moment where everyone suddenly realized who I was. Instead, the evidence simply became impossible to ignore. A professional genealogist hired by the estate uncovered records that directly contradicted the foundation of my claim. Around the same time, investigators located additional documents from overseas archives that filled several of the gaps I had relied upon. The uncertainty that had protected me for so long disappeared. Once that happened, everything unraveled quickly. The estate's legal team informed me that my claim would be rejected. Meetings were cancelled. Phone calls stopped. People who had once treated me like family no longer wanted to speak with me. A few demanded explanations. Others demanded apologies. The hardest conversation was with Margaret. She didn't yell or threaten me. She simply asked why I had done it. I couldn't give her an answer that sounded reasonable. Because there wasn't one. Greed, desperation, pride, and ego had all played a role. But none of them justified the damage. After the claim collapsed, I spent months waiting for the next disaster. Every knock at the door made me nervous. Every unknown number on my phone sent my imagination racing. I expected lawsuits, criminal charges, or some public scandal that would permanently attach my name to what I had done. Some consequences came. Others didn't. I was investigated extensively, questioned repeatedly, and forced to explain parts of my actions that sounded even worse when spoken aloud than they had inside my head. The financial and personal damage was significant. Whatever I had hoped to gain vanished completely. But the greatest punishment wasn't legal. It was psychological. For nearly a year, I had lived as someone else. I had monitored every word, every gesture, every conversation. The deception became such a large part of my daily life that I no longer knew who I was without it. When the lie disappeared, it left an empty space behind. I also had to face a difficult truth. The people I had deceived weren't faceless victims. They were real individuals who had trusted me, defended me, and welcomed me into their lives. That realization hurt more than any investigation. It's been years since I tried to become the heir to a fortune that was never mine. Time has a strange way of changing how you view your own actions. When I was living through it, I saw myself as clever, resourceful, and one step ahead of everyone else. Looking back now, I see something different. I see a man who was so desperate for a shortcut that he convinced himself deception was a solution. The biggest lesson wasn't that crime is risky. Everyone already knows that. The lesson was that lies don't merely affect other people, they slowly reshape the liar as well. Every false story demands another. Every deception creates new fears. Eventually, you spend more energy maintaining the illusion than living your actual life. Did I get away with it? No. Even though I avoided some of the worst outcomes I feared, I still lost. I lost trust, relationships, opportunities, and a part of my self-respect that took years to rebuild. If anyone reading this is considering a similar path, Don't focus on whether you'll get caught. Ask yourself what you'll become if you succeed. That answer should scare you more.